There is a moment, if you have ever stood before it, when the Colosseum simply takes your breath away. Not in the way a painting might, not in the way a sunset might, but in the way that only something ancient and enormous and true can. The way it makes your chest feel suddenly small and your mind go very, very quiet. You are looking at nearly 2,000 years of history compressed into stone, into arches, into silence. The Colosseum does not announce itself the way modern monuments do. It does not gleam. It does not shimmer. It simply stands, patient and permanent, as Rome moves and breathes and hums all around it. Tourists pass beneath its shadow. Pigeons rest in the same alcoves where senators once sat, and somewhere beneath those cracked and golden stones, the echo of 100,000 voices still waits to be heard. This is the story of that place. It began, as so many Roman stories do, with ambition. In the year 69 AD, Rome was a city in crisis. The Emperor Nero had recently died, despised, abandoned, and, by most accounts, utterly unmourned. And in the chaos that followed, 4 different men would claim the title of emperor in the space of a single year. It was a period Romans would later call the Year of the 4 Emperors, and it left the city shaken, divided, and hungry for something it had not felt in some time: stability, pride, a reason to believe in Rome again. Into this moment stepped a general named Vespasian, broad-shouldered, plain-spoken, and shrewdly practical in the way that only soldiers tend to be. Vespasian was not the most glamorous of emperors, but he understood something that the more theatrical rulers before him had missed entirely: that the people of Rome did not merely want to be fed and governed. They wanted to be united. They wanted spectacle. They wanted something they could gather around and feel together, the particular electricity of a crowd becoming one. And so, around the year 70 AD, Vespasian ordered the construction of what would become the greatest arena the ancient world had ever seen. He chose the site deliberately, where Nero had once built an extravagant private lake for his own pleasure, a symbol of imperial selfishness that the people had not forgotten. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. Vespasian would build a gift, a public monument, an amphitheater not for one man but for all of Rome. The Romans called it the Flavian Amphitheater, after the Flavian dynasty to which Vespasian belonged. The name Colosseum would come later, likely borrowed from a colossal bronze statue of Nero that once stood nearby. But whatever you call it, the ambition behind it was staggering. The construction alone is a story worth slowing down for. At its peak, an estimated 100,000 workers labored on the site, a figure that staggers the imagination even now. Among them were thousands of Jewish prisoners of war, brought to Rome following the brutal siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Alongside them worked Roman freedmen, skilled craftsmen, engineers, and specialists of every trade. They hauled limestone from quarries at Tivoli, some 16 miles away, moving an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of travertine stone across the Roman countryside. They mixed concrete and cut tufa and shaped brick, layer by patient layer, raising walls that would reach a final height of nearly 50 meters, roughly the equivalent of a modern 16-story building. It took approximately a decade. Vespasian would not live to see it finished. His son Titus completed the structure and inaugurated it in 80 AD, with 100 days of celebration so lavish, so relentless, that the city of Rome was effectively transformed into a festival for 3 straight months. Thousands of animals were killed, gladiators fought. The arena floor was flooded. Some accounts suggest this is not legend but history, to stage mock naval battles. Rome wanted the world to know that it was back, that it was glorious, that it had built something that would outlast them all. They were not wrong. The Colosseum could hold somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators, an astonishing number that rivals many modern stadiums. It had ticketed entry, numbered seating sections, covered awnings called vela to shield the crowd from the Mediterranean sun. There were concession vendors. There were exit corridors called vomitoria, designed so efficiently that the entire arena could be emptied in minutes. The Romans, whatever else one might say of them, understood crowd management. But what happened inside those walls is what history remembers most. Gladiators, wild beasts, executions staged as mythology, naval spectacles, public games that could last for weeks. This was the theater of Roman life, brutal, magnificent, and endlessly complex. And it is that world, the world inside the stone, that we are going to spend our time exploring together. So settle in. There is no need to rush. Rome was not built in a day, and her greatest monument deserves to be understood slowly and well. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the morning of a games day in Rome. The sun has barely crested the hills east of the city, and already the streets are alive. Vendors push carts of bread and olives through the narrow lanes. Children dart between the legs of adults. Somewhere in the distance, the low, resonant groan of a crowd beginning to gather drifts through the warm morning air, like the first notes of an orchestra tuning before a performance. And beneath the arena, beneath the stone and the sand and the roar that is still hours away, in the cool, lamplit darkness of the Hypogeum, the underground network of tunnels and chambers that runs beneath the Colosseum floor like a hidden city, men are waking up. They eat, they pray, they wrap their hands, they pull on armor that, depending on the man and his fighting style, might weigh anywhere from a few pounds to nearly 50. They do not speak much. There is, in those final hours, a particular quality of silence that settles over men who understand what the day holds. Not panic, not despair, something quieter than either of those things. They have trained for this. In many cases, they have trained for years. This is the world of the Roman gladiator, and it is far stranger, far richer, and far more human than the stories we tend to tell about it. Let us begin with the word itself. Gladiator comes from the Latin gladius, the short, double-edged sword that was standard issue for the Roman legionary, and the weapon most closely associated with the arena's combatants. A gladiator, in the most literal sense, was simply a swordsman, but the reality of who these men were, and occasionally who these women were, was considerably more layered than a single word can carry. The popular imagination tends to picture gladiators as slaves, chains and whips and no choice in the matter. And while it is true that a significant portion of gladiators were indeed enslaved men, often prisoners of war drawn from the far edges of the Roman world, from Gaul, from Germania, from Thrace, from the plains of North Africa, the full picture is more complicated and in some ways more surprising. A meaningful number of gladiators were volunteers, free men, Roman citizens, men who walked through the gates of a gladiatorial training school called a ludus and signed a contract that bound them to the life willingly. Some were drawn by the promise of steady food and shelter in a world where both were uncertain. Some were men in debt, for whom the arena offered a chance at the kind of prize money that could clear a ledger and start a life over. And some, this is the part that tends to catch people off guard, were drawn by something closer to ambition, to fame. Because gladiators in Rome were famous, this is perhaps the most striking thing about the gladiatorial world that the ancient sources reveal when you sit quietly with them. These men were celebrities. Their faces appeared on oil lamps sold in the markets. Their names were carved into the walls of taverns and bathhouses, the ancient equivalent of a message board. scratched in by hands that wanted the world to know who their favorite fighter was. Graffiti found in Pompeii records not just the names of gladiators, but their fight records, their physiques, their temperaments. One fighter, a man named Celadus, is described by an anonymous admirer as the one who makes girls sigh. Another is called the glory of the girls, which is the kind of phrase that makes 2,000 years collapse into nothing, because you realize immediately that human beings have not changed as much as we like to think. Young Roman women were known to seek out gladiators. Young Roman men wanted to be gladiators, at least in the abstract, the way that boys in other eras have wanted to be knights or soldiers or athletes. The gladiator occupied a peculiar social position, despised by Roman law as infames, a category of persons stripped of certain civic rights, and yet adored by the very public whose disapproval theoretically defined him. Senators passed laws forbidding Roman citizens of good standing from entering the arena. The laws had to be passed repeatedly, which tells you exactly how well they were being followed. Even emperors, on occasion, dressed as gladiators and fought in the arena. Commodus, who ruled Rome in the late 2nd century and whose grip on sanity grew increasingly uncertain as the years wore on, reportedly fought hundreds of bouts in the Colosseum, always, it must be said, against opponents who were carefully selected to ensure he would win. His gladiatorial persona was, by most accounts, the most sincere thing about him. Now, the training. If you were brought into a ludus, the great schools attached to major arenas across the Roman world, including the Ludus Magnus, which sat directly adjacent to the Colosseum itself, connected by an underground tunnel, your life would be structured in a way that might feel almost monastic in its discipline. You would sleep in small cells, usually alone. You would eat a diet that modern sports nutritionists, interestingly, would recognize as a deliberate performance regimen, high in barley and beans, rich in complex carbohydrates, designed to build not the lean, defined musculature of the Hollywood gladiator, but a thicker layer of body mass that would protect vital organs and allow a man to sustain surface wounds without losing his fighting capability. Roman gladiators were, in all likelihood, considerably less sculpted than the movies suggest. They were built to survive, not to look beautiful doing it. Training was conducted with wooden weapons before graduating to real ones. You would learn a specific fighting style. The Romans were precise about this, and that style would define not only how you fought, but who you were. Your armor, your weapons, your reputation. The Murmillo, for instance, fought with a large curved shield and a short sword, wearing a crested helmet styled after the fish. The Murmur, that gave him his name. The Thraex, or Thracian, carried a curved short sword called a sica and a small square shield, relying on speed and aggression rather than the heavy defense of his counterpart. The Retiarius was perhaps the most visually striking of all. Lightly armored, carrying a weighted net in one hand and a trident in the other, his face exposed, his strategy built entirely around mobility, entanglement, and the particular psychological weight of fighting a man who was trying to catch you like a fish. These pairings were not arbitrary. They were engineered for theatrical contrast. A heavily armored fighter against a lightly armored one. Speed against strength. Net against sword. The Romans understood in their bones the drama of opposition. And then there is the question of death. Because here, too, the popular image requires some adjustment. The arena was not, as a rule, a slaughterhouse. Gladiators were expensive. A well-trained fighter represented a significant investment on the part of the lanista, the owner and manager of a gladiatorial troupe, and killing that investment carelessly made no economic sense. Matches to the death occurred, certainly, but they were not the standard outcome of every bout. More commonly, a fight ended when one man was sufficiently wounded or exhausted to signal his surrender. By raising a finger, by dropping his shield, by falling to the ground. At that point, the crowd, and ultimately the editor. The Roman official or wealthy patron who had funded the games and therefore held authority over life and death would decide the fallen man's fate. The famous gesture we associate with this moment, the turned thumb of popular imagination, is one of history's more delightful misconceptions. Scholars still debate exactly what the Romans actually did with their thumbs. What we know is that the crowd expressed an opinion and the editor chose. Mercy was common. It was, in its own way, good entertainment. A crowd that watched a beloved fighter survive was a crowd that would come back. Death, when it came, was meant to be met with composure. A gladiator who wept or begged or struggled at the end was considered to have failed in the most fundamental way possible. The arena had its own code of dignity. Virtus, the Romans called it, a word meaning courage and excellence combined. And a man who died badly shamed himself in a way that dying at all never could. There is something in that which stays with you. In a life defined by violence and spectacle and the roar of crowds, the one thing a gladiator was never permitted to lose was his composure. His life could be taken. His dignity could not. And so they trained. And so they fought. And so they entered that sand-covered floor, blinking in the Mediterranean light, while 50,000 strangers decided how to feel about them. Some died young. Some grew old in the profession, retiring to become trainers themselves, passing the weight of the sword to younger hands. Some bought their freedom. Some were given it. A very few became wealthy. All of them, in their own way, carried Rome on their shoulders. Its appetite for glory, its complicated relationship with violence and honor, its endless, restless need to gather together and feel something. We remember the arena, but it is worth pausing just for a moment to remember the men inside it. There is a question that architects and engineers have been asking for nearly 2,000 years, and it goes something like this. How did they do it? Not in the dismissive way the question is sometimes asked, not as a way of suggesting that the Romans could not possibly have accomplished what the evidence clearly shows they accomplished, but in the genuine, humbled, slightly awed way that one craftsman asks about another, the way a composer might study a symphony that ought not to work and find themselves leaning closer, listening harder, trying to locate the precise moment where ordinary skill became something else entirely. The Colosseum is that kind of achievement. It is not merely large. It is not merely old. It is structurally intelligent in ways that continue to instruct modern engineers, and aesthetically considered in ways that reveal a civilization thinking very carefully about what a building means, not just what it does. So let us slow down. Let us walk around it. Let us look at what Rome actually built and understand, as best we can, how they built it. Begin outside. Begin at the facade. The outer wall of the Colosseum rises in 4 distinct tiers, each one expressing a different architectural order, a different visual language borrowed and refined from the Greek tradition that Rome had absorbed and made its own. At ground level, the arches are framed by engaged columns in the Doric order, simple, sturdy, unadorned. The second tier carries Ionic columns, slightly more elegant, with the gentle scroll-like capitals that give the order its characteristic softness. The third tier rises in Corinthian, the most ornate of the 3 classical orders, with capitals carved to resemble the unfurling leaves of the acanthus plant, detailed and decorative and unmistakably Roman in their confidence. The fourth and final tier is different. Solid wall, punctuated not by open arches but by small rectangular windows alternating with flat pilasters. Pilasters in the Corinthian style, maintaining visual continuity with the floor below. This uppermost level also held the brackets from which the great canvas awning, the velarium, was suspended over the crowd below. Sailors from the imperial fleet, stationed specifically at the Colosseum for this purpose, were responsible for rigging and managing the awning. On hot Roman afternoons, it moved slowly with the sun, a vast mechanical shade tracking across the sky above 50,000 heads. From the outside then, the Colosseum speaks a kind of visual grammar. It ascends, it refines itself, it becomes progressively more intricate as it rises, as though the building is reaching upward toward something, which, architecturally speaking, it is. The eye is drawn up and around and up again, tracing those 80 arched bays that punctuate the exterior at each level. And what that repetition creates is not monotony, but rhythm. The steady, unhurried rhythm of something that was designed to be experienced in time, not just seen at a glance. Now step inside. Move through one of those ground-level arches, numbered in the Roman original for the ease of crowd management, and feel the engineering close around you. The interior of the Colosseum is a masterwork of what architects call vaulted construction, and it is here, perhaps more than anywhere else, that the Roman genius for practical problem-solving reveals itself most completely. The Romans did not invent the arch, but they understood it with an intimacy that no civilization before them had quite achieved, and they applied that understanding at a scale that was, for its time, simply without precedent. The arch works because it distributes weight outward and downward along its curve, rather than bearing it straight down the way a horizontal beam does. Combine arches into a barrel vault, and you can span a corridor of almost any length. Rotate that barrel vault through a full circle, and you have a structure called a torus, or, in the Roman imagination, the skeleton of an amphitheater. What the engineers of the Colosseum built, in essence, was a series of 80 radial walls that spread outward from the center like the spokes of an enormous wheel, and then connected those walls with a complex web of barrel vaults and groin vaults running both around the circumference and inward toward the arena floor. The result is a building that is almost entirely hollow inside its walls. Corridor layered upon corridor, staircase upon staircase, gallery opening onto gallery, and yet capable of bearing the weight of tens of thousands of people simultaneously without any sign of structural distress for nearly 2,000 years. Through earthquakes, through medieval stone robbers who stripped entire sections of the outer wall for building material, through the relentless, patient erosion of time itself. It still stands. The materials deserve their own moment of attention. Roman concrete, opus caementicium, is one of the ancient world's most quietly revolutionary inventions, and the Colosseum used it in enormous quantities. Unlike modern Portland cement, which weakens over time when exposed to water, Roman concrete was made with a particular volcanic ash called pozzolana, found in abundance in the region around Rome. When this ash was mixed with seawater and lime, a chemical reaction occurred that modern materials scientists have only recently fully understood. A reaction that caused the concrete not merely to harden, but to continue strengthening over decades and centuries, as mineral crystals slowly grew within its matrix. Roman concrete got harder with age. The Colosseum's foundations are proof of that. But concrete alone did not build the Colosseum. The outer facing of the walls was travertine limestone, warm, creamy, faintly golden in afternoon light, quarried at Tivoli, and transported to Rome along roads that the empire maintained with the same bureaucratic efficiency. It applied to everything it considered essential. The interior walls used a lighter volcanic stone called tufa. Brick was used extensively in the upper sections and interior vaulting, and holding much of it together in the places where the Romans needed to fix stone to stone with mechanical precision rather than mortar, were iron clamps. Approximately 300 tons of iron clamps embedded throughout the structure, which medieval scavengers would later chisel out with such thoroughness that the pot marks they left are still visible in the stonework today. Beneath all of this, beneath the sand-covered wooden floor of the arena itself, lay perhaps the most extraordinary part of the entire structure. the hypogeum. The word means simply underground, and what it describes is a two-level network of tunnels and chambers that extended beneath the entire arena floor. A subterranean city of stone corridors and wooden lifts and iron mechanisms that hummed and creaked and turned in the darkness below, while the crowd above had no idea it existed. This was the operational heart of the Colosseum. Here were the cages for animals: lions, tigers, bears, leopards, ostriches, elephants, rhinoceroses, crocodiles, brought from every corner of the empire at staggering expense and logistics. Here were the waiting chambers for gladiators in the final minutes before their bout. Here were the pegmata, elaborate wooden elevator platforms, counterweighted with ballast, that could be raised through trapdoors in the arena floor to deliver a fighter, or a wild animal, or an entire painted stage set directly into the arena above, apparently from nowhere, in a burst of theatrical surprise that must have produced a sound from the crowd unlike anything we can quite imagine today. The Romans called this kind of stagecraft apparatus, the machinery behind the magic, and they guarded its secrets the way modern entertainment companies guard their technology. The effect from the stands was one of seamless, almost supernatural spectacle. The reality below was one of coordinated, precise, physically demanding labor carried out by dozens of workers in near darkness, pulling ropes and turning capstans, and listening for signals from above. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. Two worlds divided by a single floor of wood and sand. Above, sunlight, noise, the electricity of the crowd. Below, shadow, mechanism, the particular concentration of men doing difficult work with care. The Colosseum was not just a building, it was a machine. An extraordinarily sophisticated machine for producing and delivering an experience. Every arch, every vault, every numbered entrance, every rigged awning and hidden trapdoor served a single, unified purpose: to gather human beings together and give them something to feel. In that sense, very little has changed. We still build enormous structures and fill them with crowds. We still engineer sight lines and acoustics and crowd flow with obsessive precision. We still want, when we arrive at a great arena, to feel that we have entered somewhere outside of ordinary life, somewhere grander, louder, more vivid than the everyday. The Romans simply did it first, and they did it in stone that still stands. Imagine for a moment that you have never seen a lion, not in a photograph, not in a film, not in a zoo behind reinforced glass with a small brass plaque explaining its Latin name and its diet and its conservation status. You have simply never seen one. You have heard rumors of it. A great tawny beast from the African interior, larger than any dog, faster than any horse at full sprint, with a voice that does not so much travel through the air as move the air itself, a sound more felt in the chest than heard by the ear. Now imagine that you are sitting in a stone amphitheater on a warm Roman morning, and the floor opens, and one appears. This is what the Romans called the venatio, the hunt, and it was not a footnote to the gladiatorial games. It was not a supporting act. For much of the Colosseum's history, the venatio was the opening event of the day, and it was, in its own extraordinary way, the Roman Empire made visible. Every animal in that arena had been captured somewhere at the edges of the known world, transported across land and sea at enormous cost and logistical complexity, and delivered to the center of Rome as proof of a single, overwhelming idea: we reach everywhere. Everything bends to us. Even nature itself performs at our command. The scale of what Rome accomplished in this regard is, even now, difficult to fully absorb. Over the roughly 4 centuries that the Colosseum hosted games, the number of animals killed within its walls runs into the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates place the figure higher. At the inaugural games under the Emperor Titus in 80 AD, those 100 days of celebration that announced the Colosseum's opening to the world, approximately 9,000 animals were killed. 9,000. across a single extended festival. Lions, bears, elephants, ostriches, deer, wild boar, bulls, leopards, and species that Romans encountered at the borders of their empire, and for which they sometimes had no adequate Latin word. The Emperor Trajan, celebrating his victories in Dacia in 107 AD, staged games over 123 days, during which 11,000 animals were killed alongside 10,000 gladiators. These are numbers that require a moment of stillness. Not to celebrate them, they speak to a relationship with the natural world that sits deeply, uncomfortably beside our own. But to understand them, because the Romans were not thoughtless about this, they were deliberate. The killing was the point. The abundance was the message. An emperor who could fill the Colosseum with lions was an emperor who controlled the world that lions came from. To understand how those animals arrived in Rome, you have to travel back to the source, to the deserts and forests and river deltas of the empire's edges, and watch the process begin. Professional hunters called bestiari, working under imperial contracts, operated across North Africa, sub-Saharan trade routes, the forests of Germania, the Caucasus, the river plains of Mesopotamia. Their work was dangerous, expensive, and logistically staggering, capturing a lion alive, which was required if the animal was to survive the journey and arrive in Rome in fighting condition, demanded nets, speed, coordination, and an intimate knowledge of animal behavior that these men developed over years of practice. Some hunters worked from horseback, some on foot. Some dug concealed pits with covered openings, luring animals with bait and retrieving them from below. Once captured, the animals began a journey that could last months. They were transported in wooden cages, reinforced with iron bars, loaded onto carts and then ships, managed by handlers who understood that a stressed animal was a dying animal, and that a dying animal was a financial catastrophe. Food had to be sourced along the route, water had to be carried, wounds sustained during capture had to be treated. The Romans developed what was, in effect, a continent-spanning logistics network dedicated entirely to the movement of wildlife, and it functioned for centuries with remarkable efficiency. At the port of Ostia, Rome's harbor at the mouth of the Tiber, ships carrying animals would dock, and their cargo would be transferred to riverboats for the journey upriver into the city. From there, the animals entered a network of holding facilities, vivaria, essentially large enclosures, that surrounded Rome and served as staging areas before the animals were moved to the Colosseum itself. The vivarium on the Caelian Hill, situated just outside the arena, was the final stop. It was here that animals rested, if rest is the right word for creatures in captivity awaiting an unknown fate, before being moved into the hypogeum below the arena floor. The men who fought the animals in the arena deserved their own careful attention. They are often conflated with gladiators in the popular imagination, but the Romans drew a clear distinction. The venatores, hunters, were trained specifically for animal combat, and they occupied their own social and professional world within the broader ecosystem of arena performance. Like gladiators, they trained in dedicated schools. Like gladiators, some of them became famous. Unlike gladiators, they fought not other men but creatures of extraordinary speed, strength, and unpredictability, and the skill required to do this well, to read an animal's movement, to anticipate its attack, to position oneself in the fraction of a second between one motion and the next, was a form of physical intelligence that spectators recognized and admired. A skilled venator did not simply survive an encounter with a lion. He made it look choreographed. He moved with the animal, circled it, drew it into patterns that the crowd could follow and anticipate, building tension in the way that a storyteller builds tension, through rhythm and timing and the careful management of expectation. Some venators worked with spears, some with short swords. Some, in the more theatrical productions, were costumed as mythological figures, turning the hunt into a kind of living narrative that the educated Roman audience, saturated in the stories of Hercules and Theseus and Orpheus, could read like a text. There are records of venatores who survived dozens of bouts, who retired to comfortable lives on the money their performances earned, who were celebrated in the same breath as the great gladiators of their era. There are also, of course, records of those who did not survive. But there is another dimension to the animals in the Colosseum that tends to get lost beneath the spectacle, and it is worth pausing on: the arrival of exotic animals in Rome, even before they entered the arena, was itself an event. A public procession of caged animals through the streets of the city drew enormous crowds. Ordinary Romans, people who spend their lives within a few miles of where they were born, who had never traveled beyond the borders of Italy and never would, could stand at the edge of a road and watch a rhinoceros pass, could see, with their own eyes, a creature from a world so distant it barely seemed real. This was education of a kind, crude, context-free, utterly divorced from any understanding of ecology or behavior or the lives these animals had lived before the net and the cage. But it was also, for people who had no other access to the natural world beyond their immediate surroundings, a genuine window into the scale and strangeness of the planet they lived on. The Romans found it wondrous. Their writers recorded encounters with new animals with a mixture of practical description and barely contained amazement that is rather touching when you read it. Pliny the Elder, cataloguing the hippopotamus with the careful attention of a man who cannot quite believe what he is looking at. Cicero writing letters that grumble about the cost of transporting leopards for public games while simultaneously conveying, in the details he includes, that he finds the whole enterprise rather magnificent. The ecological consequences of what Rome did in the Colosseum are real, and they are with us still. The North African elephant, a smaller, forest-dwelling relative of the African bush elephant, was hunted to extinction, in no small part due to Roman demand. The Barbary lion, once ranging across the entire northern coast of Africa, was extirpated from that continent. Hippos vanished from the lower Nile. The Atlas bear disappeared, species by species. The arena's appetite reshaped the wildlife of 3 continents. Rome did not think in those terms. No civilization of that era possessed the conceptual framework to understand what we would now call an ecosystem, or to anticipate the consequences of removing apex predators from a landscape at scale. They saw abundance. They used it. And by the time the games ended and the Colosseum fell silent, the world outside its walls was measurably, permanently quieter. There is something in that which the stones themselves seem to hold, a kind of gravity that goes beyond architecture, a weight that has nothing to do with limestone or concrete. The animals are gone, but the arena remembers them. There is an old Roman expression, panem et circenses, that has survived the fall of the empire, outlasted the language that produced it, and lodged itself so permanently in the vocabulary of political thought that we still reach for it today. Bread and circuses. The poet Juvenal coined the phrase in the early 2nd century AD, and he meant it as a criticism, a lament that the Roman people, once fierce and politically engaged, had grown passive and manageable, content so long as their stomachs were full and the games were running. It was a complaint about manipulation, about the way that spectacle, when deployed with sufficient skill, can substitute for governance, can replace the messy, difficult work of actually listening to people with the far simpler work of dazzling them. What Juvenal understood, and what every emperor who ever sat in the imperial box of the Colosseum understood rather more practically, was this: the arena was never just entertainment. It was politics. It was theater. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a performance of power. and the emperor was always, regardless of what was happening on the sand below, the main event. To understand why, you have to understand the peculiar position that Roman emperors occupied. They were, in theory, not kings. Rome had expelled its kings centuries before the Colosseum was built, and the memory of that expulsion, the deep, almost genetic Roman aversion to the very idea of monarchy, never entirely faded, even as the empire grew more autocratic and its rulers more absolute. An emperor could command armies, control the treasury, appoint governors to provinces spanning 3 continents, and order the death of senators without trial. But he could not, if he wished to maintain the fiction of the republic that legitimized his rule, simply declare himself above the people. He had to perform his relationship with the people, constantly, publicly, in ways that were visible and legible to the crowd. And no stage was larger, or more visible, or more carefully watched than the Colosseum. The imperial box, the Pulvinar, sat on the south side of the arena at the lowest level, offering the best sight lines in the building. It was elevated enough to be seen from every seat in the house, separated enough from the crowd to convey dignity, but close enough to the action below to make clear that the emperor was present, engaged, sharing, at least symbolically, in the experience of his people. This proximity was deliberate and carefully managed. When an emperor arrived at the games, the entire crowd rose. The noise was, by all accounts, overwhelming. Tens of thousands of voices producing a sound that visitors to modern stadiums will recognize in its physical dimensions. That sensation of sound as pressure, of being inside something rather than merely hearing it. The emperor acknowledged the crowd acknowledged the emperor, and in that exchange, something important was being negotiated. The crowd could express approval. They could also express disapproval, and Roman emperors, for all their theoretical power, were acutely, sometimes desperately, sensitive to the difference. The games gave ordinary Romans a forum, one of the very few available to them, in which dissatisfaction could be voiced in a setting too public and too large for easy reprisal. A crowd of 50,000 people booing is not a crowd that can be quietly arrested. Emperors who were losing the affection of the people felt it first and most viscerally in the arena. Caligula, whose relationship with the crowd deteriorated catastrophically in the final years of his reign, reportedly responded to public mockery at the games by ordering the awning withdrawn on particularly hot days, punishing the crowd with sunburn in a fit of imperial petulance that did absolutely nothing for his popularity, and rather a great deal for the historical impression of him as a man coming apart at the seams. The smarter emperors understood the games as an instrument, as something to be played with the same deliberateness a musician brings to a difficult piece. Augustus, the first emperor, was in many ways the architect of this understanding. He attended the games with conspicuous regularity, brought his family, sat visibly, paid attention. He understood that being seen to enjoy what the people enjoyed was itself a political act, a declaration of solidarity with the crowd that cost nothing and purchased enormous goodwill. He standardized the games, regulated their frequency, capped their excess just enough to appear responsible, while ensuring they remained spectacular enough to produce the desired effect. He was, in the language of our own era, extraordinarily good at managing his public image. Vespasian, who commissioned the Colosseum, had the same instincts, sharpened by a military man's pragmatism. He had come to power through a civil war, not through dynastic inheritance, and he knew that the legitimacy of his rule rested on a foundation that needed constant maintenance. The Colosseum was, among other things, a monument to the idea that Vespasian belonged in power, that his rule was good for Rome, generous to Rome, worthy of Rome. An emperor who builds the greatest arena in the world is an emperor who is difficult to argue against. His son Titus understood this inheritance and extended it. The 100 days of inaugural games that opened the Colosseum in 80 AD were not an extravagance. They were an investment. Titus died 2 years later, beloved by the Roman people to a degree that was unusual even by imperial standards, and the games he gave them formed a significant part of that affection. He had spent money on them, he had spent attention on them. In Roman political terms, these were not small gestures. Then there are the emperors for whom the arena became something more personal and considerably more troubling. Nero, who preceded the Colosseum's construction, famously performed publicly, singing, acting, competing in chariot races, in ways that deeply unsettled the Roman aristocracy, who considered such displays beneath imperial dignity. Nero did not fight in the Colosseum, which was not yet built, but his appetite for personal performance established a template that later emperors would follow to more extreme conclusions. Commodus, who ruled from 177 to 192 AD, and whose deteriorating mental state is documented with a kind of horrified fascination by contemporary sources, provides the most extraordinary example of what happened when an emperor's relationship with the arena became unmoored from political calculation entirely. Commodus fought in the Colosseum, not symbolically, not in staged exhibitions of nominal danger. He dressed as a gladiator, took a gladiatorial name, Hercules Romanus, Roman Hercules, and descended into the arena to fight, insisting all the while that he was genuinely risking himself, which was technically true only in the sense that any activity involving sharp objects carries some marginal risk. His opponents were carefully selected. His victories were, by any honest accounting, arranged. Senators were required to attend and to cheer, which they did with the particular enthusiasm of men who understood the consequences of insufficient applause. The crowd's response was more complicated. Commodus was, by some accounts, genuinely skilled with certain weapons, particularly the bow, which he used to kill animals in the arena with considerable accuracy, and there was a portion of the Roman public that found his performances genuinely entertaining, in the same complicated way that people have always been entertained by power, doing something unexpected. But for the governing class, for the senators and generals and administrators who ran the machinery of empire, Commodus in the arena was a source of constant, grinding humiliation. An emperor fighting as a gladiator was an emperor who had placed himself among the infames, the disgraced, and dragged the office of Caesar into the sand with him. He was assassinated in 1922 AD. His gladiatorial career was not the cause, but it was a symptom of exactly the kind of disconnect between an emperor and his governing class that tended, in Rome, to end badly. What all of these men, the shrewd and the reckless, the calculating and the unhinged, shared was an understanding that the Colosseum demanded something of them, that to sit in the imperial box was to accept a kind of accountability that existed nowhere else in Roman public life. The crowd below could not vote, could not petition, could not, in most circumstances, speak to power in any meaningful way, but they could cheer, and they could go silent, and they could turn 50,000 at once, in a direction that even the most absolute ruler in the ancient world could not ignore without cost. The arena was the place where emperor and people faced each other most honestly, where the performance of power and the reality of power came closest to touching. In that sand, for better or worse, Rome told the truth about itself. Nothing lasts forever, not empires, not dynasties, not even stone. And yet, there is something particular about the silence that eventually fell over the Colosseum, something that did not arrive all at once, in a single dramatic moment of collapse, but crept in gradually, the way dusk creeps into a summer evening, almost imperceptibly, until you look up and realize that the light has gone, and you cannot say precisely when it left. The end of the games was not a single event. It was a long, slow unraveling, economic, political, cultural, and finally moral, that stretched across centuries and left the greatest arena in the world standing empty and increasingly strange in the center of a city that was itself becoming something it had never been before. To understand how the Colosseum fell silent, you have to understand how Rome fell. And to understand how Rome fell, you have to resist the temptation of simple answers. The 3rd century AD is where the unraveling begins to accelerate. Historians sometimes call it the crisis of the 3rd century, which is the kind of name that manages to be both entirely accurate and somehow insufficient for what it actually describes. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period of roughly 50 years, the Roman Empire cycled through approximately 50 different emperors. Some ruled for years, some for months, some for weeks. Several were killed by their own soldiers almost immediately upon taking power, which gives you some sense of how stable the political environment had become. The consequences for the games were immediate and practical. The Munera, the gladiatorial games, and the Venations, the animal hunts, were extraordinarily expensive to stage. They required imperial funding, logistical infrastructure, political will, and the kind of long-range planning that simply cannot survive in an environment where no one is confident that the man currently funding the games will still be alive by the time they are scheduled to occur. Across the 3rd century, the frequency of games in Rome began to decline. The spectacles became less elaborate, the animals rarer, the gladiatorial combat smaller in scale. The machinery of the hypogeum still turned, but with less certainty and less ambition than it once had. This was not immediately visible to an ordinary Roman watching from the stands. The games continued. The Colosseum remained the center of Roman public life, in a way that had no real equivalent anywhere else in the city. But the trajectory had shifted, quietly, in a direction from which it would never fully recover. Then came Constantine, in 32 AD. The Emperor Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, a victory he attributed famously to the Christian god, whom he had invoked before the battle, in a gesture that would change the course of Western history, far more dramatically than any military engagement had any right to. Constantine did not immediately make Christianity the official religion of the empire. That would come later, under Theodosius in 380 AD, but his conversion, and the imperial favor that followed it, set in motion a shift in Roman culture that would eventually reach the Colosseum and transform what happened there beyond recognition. The Christian Church had a complicated relationship with the arena that is worth pausing to understand carefully, because it is often oversimplified in both directions. On one hand, the gladiatorial games and the public executions that took place in the Colosseum were precisely the kind of spectacle that early Christian writers condemned with consistent force: the violence, the appetite for blood, the reduction of human life to entertainment. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, argued that Christians who attended the games were spiritually contaminating themselves, absorbing a cruelty that was incompatible with the values of their faith. Augustine, a century and a half later, told the story of a friend who attended the games intending merely to observe, and found himself, almost against his will, swept up in the crowd's excitement, roaring at the blood, screaming for more. In a passage that reads as a precise psychological account of how spectacle bypasses rational judgment. On the other hand, the Church's opposition to the games was neither immediate nor absolute in its practical effects. Constantine himself banned gladiatorial combat in 325 AD, an edict remarkable for existing, and equally remarkable for how thoroughly it was ignored. The games continued for decades after his prohibition, partly because the imperial apparatus that might have enforced such a ban was already too fragmented to apply it consistently, and partly because the appetite of the Roman public for the arena was not something that could be legislated away by a single imperial decree, however sincere. What actually ended gladiatorial combat, to the extent that it can be attributed to a single moment, was not a law, but a man. In 404 AD, according to sources including the historian Theodoret. A Christian monk named Telemachus, sometimes called Almachus, descended from the stands of the Colosseum during a gladiatorial bout and stepped onto the sand, placing himself physically between the combatants in an attempt to stop the fight. The crowd, by some accounts, stoned him to death on the spot. By other accounts, he was killed by one of the gladiators whose bout he had interrupted. The details vary depending on the source, and historians approach the story with appropriate caution. But what followed, regardless of the precise details, was this. The Emperor Honorius, moved, or so the sources tell us, by Telemachus's death, issued a prohibition on gladiatorial games that appears, unlike Constantine's earlier edict, to have actually taken effect. The evidence for gladiatorial combat in Rome after 404 AD is thin to non-existent. The gladiators, after 3.5 centuries of sand and blood and roaring crowds, simply stopped. The animal hunts persisted somewhat longer. The Venetians continued into the 6th century, sustained by a public appetite for spectacle that outlasted the empire's capacity to feed it at full scale, but proved more durable than many expected. The last recorded games in the Colosseum date to 523 AD, a venatio staged under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who ruled Italy in the decades after the Western Roman Empire's formal collapse in 476 AD, and who maintained Roman institutions with a deliberate, almost nostalgic fidelity that speaks to how powerfully those institutions had come to define what civilization meant. After 523, the sources go quiet. No games are recorded. The Colosseum, for the first time in nearly 5 centuries, had nothing scheduled. What followed was a long, strange afterlife that says as much about the medieval world as the Roman one. Stripped of its original purpose, the Colosseum became, over the following centuries, everything except what it had been built to be. In the 6th century, it served briefly as a cemetery. Graves dug into the arena floor and the surrounding corridors by the Christian communities that now dominated Rome's spiritual landscape. At some point in the early medieval period, a small church was constructed within the interior, consecrating the space in a way that would have baffled and perhaps appalled the engineers who built it. Later still, the building became a fortress, seized and held by the powerful Frangipani family in the 12th century, who appreciated its massive walls for the same reason military minds have always appreciated massive walls. And through all of this, the stones themselves were leaving. The practice of spoliation, the harvesting of building materials from older structures for use in new construction, was standard practice throughout the medieval period, and the Colosseum was too large and too conveniently located to escape it. The marble that once faced the interior seating was stripped and burned in lime kilns to make mortar. The iron clamps that held the travertine blocks together were pried out and reforged. Entire sections of the outer wall were quarried away and used in the construction of churches, palaces, and eventually St. Peter's Basilica itself, a detail that carries a certain historical irony given how many Christians had died in the Colosseum's predecessors and how the church had struggled to end what happened within these walls. By some estimates, 2/3 of the original Colosseum's material was removed over the medieval centuries. What stands today is a remnant, magnificent, overwhelming, humbling in its scale, but a remnant nonetheless. The complete structure, had it survived intact, would have been something that even our already staggered imaginations might struggle to hold. There is a moment, standing in the Colosseum today, when you become aware of all the absences. The marble gone, the wooden floor gone, revealing the hypogeum below like a wound that never quite healed. The awning gone, the crowd gone, the animals and the fighters and the emperors and the vendors and the priests and the 50,000 voices all gone. And yet the arches stand. The outer wall, incomplete but undefeated, curves against the Roman sky exactly as it has for 19 centuries. The stone holds its weight, patient and permanent. waiting for the next pair of eyes to come and stand before it and go quiet. Some things, it turns out, survive their purpose. Some things outlast everything that gave them meaning, and in doing so, find a meaning of their own, deeper, stranger, and more durable than anything their builders planned. The Colosseum did not fall. It simply changed what it was for. Every great monument eventually becomes two things simultaneously. It remains what it always was: stone, mortar, the accumulated labor of human hands working toward a specific purpose in a specific time, and it becomes something else entirely. A symbol, a mirror, a surface onto which every generation that encounters it projects its own questions, its own anxieties, its own need to find in the ancient world some reflection of itself. The Colosseum has become both of these things so completely, so thoroughly, that it is now almost impossible to separate them. To stand before it is to stand before Rome itself, not the historical Rome of census records and military dispatches and engineering specifications, but the idea of Rome, which has proven rather more indestructible than any of its physical structures. The modern world's relationship with the Colosseum begins, in many ways, with the poets. In 1818, Lord Byron stood before the ruins and wrote of the arena with a reverence that set a template for how the 19th century would approach ancient Rome, with longing, with melancholy, with that particular romantic ache for a greatness that feels simultaneously inspiring and irretrievably lost. The Colosseum became, in the literature and painting of that era, a meditation on time itself, on what civilizations build and what they leave behind, on the strange, humbling persistence of stone in a world where everything else, ambition, empire, the names of emperors, eventually fades. That meditation has never really ended. It simply changed its medium. The Colosseum has appeared in more films, more novels, more paintings, more photographs than almost any structure on Earth. It has been recreated in digital environments and built in miniature and reproduced on currency and tattooed on human skin. It has been the backdrop for gladiatorial fantasy and serious historical drama and tourist photographs taken by people who drove 8 hours to stand before it and feel, for a moment, the full weight of something that has genuinely lasted. But the Colosseum's legacy is not only aesthetic, it is structural, in the most literal sense. The elliptical stadium, that fundamental shape, those tiered seating banks, those numbered entrances radiating outward like spokes, is so thoroughly embedded in how human beings think about gathering together to watch something that we rarely pause to notice its origin. Every modern sports arena, every amphitheater, every concert venue that seats tens of thousands of people in tiered rows around a central floor owes something, directly or indirectly, to what Roman engineers worked out in travertine and concrete on the edge of the Palatine Hill 2,000 years ago. The crowd management systems, the sight lines, the acoustics, the flow of people in and out of an enormous space without catastrophe. These are not modern inventions. They are Roman solutions, refined over centuries of practical application, and passed forward through architectural tradition, so continuously that the inheritance became invisible. We still build colosseums. We simply call them by other names. And then there is the moral legacy, the one that sits less comfortably and demands more from us. The Colosseum asks questions that do not resolve neatly. It asks what we mean when we talk about civilization, whether a society that produced Virgil and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, that built roads and aqueducts and legal systems that still underpin our own, can be understood alongside the same society that turned death into entertainment and filled its greatest building with the sound of crowds cheering for blood. The answer, of course, is that it can, that it must be, that human civilization has never been a single, coherent thing moving uniformly toward light, but always a tangle of achievement and cruelty, beauty and violence, genius and moral failure, existing simultaneously in the same place, sometimes in the same person. Rome is not unique in this. It is simply unusually visible. Its contradictions are written in stone, still standing, still drawing 6 million visitors a year to stand in its shadow and feel whatever it is they feel. What the Colosseum ultimately leaves us with is not a lesson exactly. Lessons imply conclusions, and the Colosseum resists conclusion. It is too large, too layered, too genuinely complex for the kind of neat moral packaging we tend to prefer. What it offers instead is something rarer and more valuable than a lesson. It offers presence, the presence of all those lives, the fighters and the emperors and the crowd and the animals and the workers in the dark beneath the floor, compressed into stone and held there, patient and permanent, waiting for us to come and stand quietly and understand, in whatever imperfect way we can, that the distance between their world and ours is both very great and very small. We are still building arenas. We are still filling them with crowds. We are still gathering together, 50,000 at a time, to feel something larger than ourselves, to be part of something that will be remembered. The Colosseum understood this about us before we understood it about ourselves. And in the long golden afternoons when the light falls across those ancient stones just so, and the shadows lengthen inside the broken arches, and the city hums quietly around it, it seems in some way that defies easy explanation to understand it still.